to the post-privacy economy. Why this panel? We are at a fork in the road. In the past, many values of society were based on us not having data. If you think about our laws, many of our laws are based on us not having data. For example, insurance, or for that matter, any risk trading business is based on us not knowing. Pooling of risk means you and I are in the same pool because we don't know how our risks really are. Or, say, speed limits. The same speed limit to everybody, irrespective of how fast they are to react, or how tired they are, or how drunk they are. So that has changed. We now know an incredible amount about data, about people, and the question is, what do we do with it? In less than 3 months, in Europe, the GDPR, the new General Data Protection Regulation, will be enforced. Huge effects for any company that does business with EU citizens. So I have deeply thought about it, and actually have written a whole book called Data for the People that came out last year, and is looking at what rights should individuals have towards the data they create, both rights of seeing things, which are called transparency rights, and rights of doing things, which are called action rights. So I'm very happy to talk more about the consumer perspective in a bit. But here at the Montgomery Summit, we clearly take the perspective of companies and of investors. So the same story, my being the chief scientist at Amazon and figuring out what we as companies think about our consumers and the data they create, the same story that led to the book also led to a set of few rules how companies should think about data. So what I want to do here in this panel on the post-privacy economy is first to define what I mean by post-privacy economy, and then spend maybe 4 minutes discussing with 3 dear friends of what they think, which is probably more interesting than what I think. And the goal is, at the end of the day, to land and to think about fairness, about trust, and about what I think is all of our need to do about data literacy. That's the plan. I'll leave 5 minutes at the end for questions. If you have comments, remarks, if you want to add something, we'll do that at the end. Otherwise, just getting a bit too complex if we do it during the talk. All right. 20 years ago, Scott McNealy, then the CEO of Sun Microsystems, said, "You have zero privacy, get over it." Have you gotten over it? How do we think about it 20 years later? At that stage, in '99, I had already for 10 years been broadcasting my geolocation day for day through Unix, the .plan file. And I distinctly remember when I was in China, mainland China, the first time, that absurd hurdles of getting to a computer that's connected to the United States and updating my plan file. So for me, if you go to weigend.com/where, it tells you where I'm sitting. It even tells you where I was sitting yesterday. So actually, I want to tell you a little story about what happened on the plane. I was there in 21A, the exit row, in United Economy, and there were 2 people behind me, a man and a woman. And, you know, the man clearly tried to impress that woman, and they seemed not to know each other from beforehand. So he thought she was maybe hard of hearing and really tried to get across to her. And it felt she didn't really want to hear, but, you know, none of my business. But I asked them, because I wanted to actually think about my talk today, whether they, you know, wouldn't mind turning down their level just a little bit, which had no effect. Then I thought, I had my iPhone, and I turned around and said, "I hope you don't mind if I just record this here, because I'm listening to it anyways, just in case." And they suddenly stopped the conversation. Actually, it turns out the gentleman is here at the Montgomery summit, but not in this room, because he probably didn't know who I was. So think about that interesting aspect of privacy, that they had no worries, or he at least had no worries trying to tell her all kinds of things how rich he is. He was still flying economy. On the other hand, the moment I put that microphone up and threatened to record it, absolute silence. I don't know how you would have reacted.
That's great.
So in short, privacy is a romantic notion. I think in a public space, we certainly have no privacy. When people have any other thoughts, they typically point to the cameras which are observing us. And if you thought those microphones in your telephones in your room are only used when you're turning them on, then think again. And if you inspect the sprinklers in your room, in some sprinklers there are little cameras sitting. Now, I could go on forever and telling the stories, like talking about cameras. I just got back from China last week, trying to sell my house in Shanghai. And I was sitting in the bathroom, and I noticed the camera. And I thought, I mean, that's kind of not even privacy, but the private parts, in front where I was sitting down there. And then I tried to figure out, why do they have a camera there? And the official answer is to reduce the stealing of toilet paper. Every 7 minutes, 30 centimeters. I have no idea whether the Public Security Bureau in China does anything else with those data on that face recognition of what happens behind the door in public bathrooms. So there are many stories I can do to scare you. What I want to say, the second part here, the post-privacy economy. So I'm very aware of behavior economics, of how people actually make decisions versus how they ought to be making decisions, the descriptive versus the normative aspect. But I invite you to think here, what would be the equation of privacy? How much are we willing to pay for privacy? And to really bring it home for this audience, I would like everybody to stand up, please. It's a two alternative forced choice question. So either after the question, if you agree to it, you sit down, or you stand up. This means you don't agree to it, okay? And I'm sorry for the people who are standing in front of the wall. You just need to sit on the floor, okay? So here's the question. Who of you is long on privacy? Meaning, who of you would invest into services or products that assume people are willing to pay for privacy? If you say, yes, I'm long on privacy, then I ask you now, please sit down. All right. Good. I am also still standing because I am short on privacy, and that doesn't mean, you can now sit down as well. Just remember, it doesn't mean that I don't have my worries. Actually, my dad spent many years in prison in East Germany because his roommate of a few weeks was assumed to be an American spy. And that was in the 50s, before I was born, and it was at a time when it really was difficult to prove anything with data. Yes, they found some entry in some notebook, and that was sufficient for the Soviet occupying forces at the time. So for me, a key worry I have is, what data do I create that can be interpreted or possibly misinterpreted by a government and put me behind bars? Slightly different story. About 15 years ago, I bought an apartment in Shanghai, Jiang. And to be honest, I don't know why, but it was right after 9/11. I decided I need to diversify. I can't have all my eggs in the United States. I decided to assume a Chinese name, Wei Xuan, a nice name, the one in the shore looking, or the ocean looking at the shore. I like the name, so my apartment is under my Chinese name. My bank account is under my Chinese name. Everything's under my Chinese name. Now I'm trying to sell it. And how do I establish that this actually is my apartment? Not easy. So if anybody has any ideas, I'm actively trying to resolve that problem. It's a question about identity. And it is what seemed to be fun at the time. Could be, a 7-digit loss if I don't manage to actually show that that really was me. Other worries I have, just to give maybe one more here, is medical. That again, things that seem innocent enough now, like the saliva you're leaving on that water bottle there, that suffices to figure out certain things, certain probabilities about your future. So should that be used? We think probably not. On the other hand, if you find yourself in an emergency room and they said, oh, we just happen to be pulling up those data from you when you're still well, and it turned out XYZ, thus we do ABC, then maybe you're grateful. So long story short, despite me being short on privacy, that doesn't mean I don't have any worries about privacy, but I do believe in an economics framework that ultimately the things will be from an economic perspective. All right, so that's what I had promised to do up front. Now we have about 15 minutes for the four of us, and for that I just sit down. And why don't we just go in the order which we have here, and let me introduce Raven. Raven came up to me when he was a freshman after the talk I gave at Stanford. And we really have become good friends over the years. He was my teaching assistant at Stanford, at Berkeley, at Fudan in Shanghai, and many other stories. Raven, after Stanford, went to Tesla. After Tesla, went to Facebook. And after Facebook now, is a founding engineer of his company, Ubiquity6, which is not doing AI, the first time I'm mentioning AI, but AR. And by the way, I don't want to be clear, so far, ladies and gentlemen, as hard as it is, this was a blockchain-free talk. Raven, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I just want to clarify that, so I am short on privacy in the sense of as an investment thesis, right? So it's the idea that investing in services that go the extra mile of providing privacy protection to users is necessarily a good idea. And that's what I mean by being short on privacy. I'm not necessarily short on the idea of privacy. I think personally I would still like to have it. But I could conceive of a future where people in general feel less attachment to privacy, and we have a system that can work in that future, whether or not we personally want to live in that future. Yeah, just a point of clarification. But that was a great introduction, and Andreas have always been like a great mentor, and I think we have had a lot of interesting adventures together in China, in Singapore. I think it's been a great journey, and I think I'm excited by this conversation that we're about to have. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Gam, I met also more than 10 years ago when he tried to entice me to sell him my data. And not only to sell him my data, but it was my 50th birthday party, and there were lots of people at my party, and he actually was wondering if you could mine these pictures of what people would say. There's some billionaires because I'm a limited partner in Founders Fund, so some friends came, and he really was very curious about what I would charge for those data. So that notion about paying people for their data, I do not know anybody else than Gam who has really done this for decades, deeply thought about it. So when we talk about the post-privacy economy, I thought it would be wonderful to have Gam on this panel.
Thank you, Andreas. I stood up and said I was long on privacy, but I'm actually a little bit confused because Andreas and I do a number of consulting jobs together where we help organizations commercialize their data. And the advice that we give is take every single piece of data that you have, that all your partners and supply chain partners have, that the internet has, and then go and manufacture some more. So my professional advice has always been go short on privacy, grab every piece of data you can. However, in this conversation, one of the things as a product manager, I believe, is you can engineer new concepts and propositions that actually have privacy built in. So for this panel, I'll take the position of being long.
Bobby I only met relatively recently, and it was in the context of getting 2 kilograms of a controlled substance out of China. So Bobby was running the Bitcoin BTCC in Shanghai, and through a mutual friend who is in the audience, I'm not sure whether he wants to be identified, I was given the lead that maybe I can have a conversation with Bobby and he could help me with those kilograms, 2 kilograms of that controlled substance. It turned out that that was not possible. Instead, I needed to go to the bank who laundered it. And there's one bank in Shanghai, and in case anybody needs to know, if you have 2 kilograms of gold, that is the controlled substance because you can only take 50 grams out each time. Then you need to go to a bank and they have a melting oven. You wait until it melts and they do mass spectroscopy analysis to make sure that what you're bringing and what they're buying really is gold. But since that didn't work, that didn't stop me from inviting Bobby to be on this panel and tell us some of the other stories he has.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So I actually didn't know that you met me for the purpose of laundering your gold. So maybe that was nicely done. So we were talking about gold. It's gold for all we know is valuable, but turns out it's a controlled substance. It's very much a controlled substance. Countries don't allow you to import it without declaring it, and some countries don't even allow you to export it. And what you did with the ICBC bank, they melted it down for him. That's essentially money laundering, right? They wiped away all traces of the history of how you got the gold, who you got it from, and they're going to repackage it, melt it, and cast it into new gold bars and selling it to unbeknown customers. So as much as banks, my angle is obviously Bitcoin and digital currencies, but as much as banks try to play the KYC and anti-money laundering rules on all of us, they do it very much all the time. So that proves it. So anyways, in terms of privacy and Bitcoin, my take is just a comment about the cash society, right? We've had money for many years using cash, paper notes, and coins. The side effects is actually people can use cash to buy things anonymously. But in the more modern age today, in China especially with WeChat Pay, Alipay, in the US, PayPal, and so on, Venmo, and whatever. So we're losing our privacy in terms of purchasing things. So that's the trade-off we have to be aware of when we go to a fully digital world, how we pay for things. When we buy things on Amazon, you lose all privacy. Whereas in the past, you go to a bookstore, you could buy books without people knowing what books you're reading. But now Amazon knows everything. So it's a real topic to pay attention to. And with Bitcoin, the idea is to bring privacy back. The idea that people can use cryptocurrencies to pay for goods and services online or even in person without being traced back to who you are. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys more on this.
So I think it should be a chat. So rather than me firing questions at people, I think conversation is the right mode. You're all super bright, super wonderful, willing people to engage.
Should we grab the Scott McNeely quote? Because I think that's a good place to begin.
Which quote?
You have no privacy, you never have, get over it.
Scott McNeely, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I feel that if you think about it, the problem for me is that we have had no privacy. There was always somebody who knew something about us. All of our facts were obvious in the public domain. Just the difference, sort of then, we knew who had them. The difference now is we have no idea where our data is landing. It is processed and reprocessed and sold on. And actually, unlike oil, which is data, which is the new oil, that every time you process it, you actually add value to it. And so today, the problem is historically we knew who we could trust. We trusted our doctor, our bank manager, our families. Today, there's no trust mechanism. That's what I feel. It's not quite a lack of privacy, it's a trust mechanism as to who has our data and who can process. And that's where this, I don't know, maybe it's a misguided notion of privacy comes in.
I mean, I used to trust Google. I had all my videos from classes from the 10 years up at YouTube. Until one day in April last year, it disappeared. Some crawler, internal crawler, went over it, and over 10 years plus, it's quite complex, to see how permissions changed, and decided, poof, there goes my channel. So it took me a while, a couple of days, to realize this by people saying, why did you take your channel down? And then eventually, I really got to talk to a person who reports to the CEO. He had me over for dinner, and he was super sorry that they couldn't do anything about it. Because 2 weeks had passed, and now if Google was to admit that they didn't purge the data, then they would be in violation of the EU right to be forgotten. So there was, even if they could, there wasn't anything technologically they could legally do about it. So that was interesting, how a company I deeply trusted just lost my data. So I want, instead of the right to be forgotten, I want the right to be remembered, which again, of course, is a privacy short right as opposed to a privacy long right.
So I think when it comes to the question of whether we as a society or as investors should be long or short privacy, I think a useful analogy is climate change. I think if we think about the way that we think about investments into green energy, I think the assumption here is that, first of all, there's a social good, which is sustainable energy, which is preserving our environment. Now, I think if we assume that there's a good that we want to achieve, then investing in green technology has both a component of achieving that goal and also satisfying customer demand for that kind of technology. Now, I think with privacy, I think it is the factual benefits of privacy and what customers demand of privacy are two different things. I think it's the factual benefits of privacy may not necessarily pan out in the long run. I think we are seeing some of that backlash today with things like fake news. I think the same tools that allow people to be anonymous and to be private on the internet are showing signs of being easily abused. And on the other hand, people do express the desire for privacy, and they do express the desire to pay for maybe services that would give them privacy. So I think it comes down to, is it what people say they want, or is it what they really want? People say they want privacy because they think there is an ultimate good at the end of the road. But if that good is never realized, and if in fact there are actual dangers to that path, then maybe what people say they want is not what they really want.
What are the dangers to that path for the privacy?
Yeah, so I think fake news is an example of that. I think that we are reaching a point where the anonymity provided by the internet seems like something that people are starting to be uncomfortable with. And I think that's not necessarily to say that the only way to solve that problem is to remove privacy. But I think that you have to acknowledge that there is a contention, there is kind of a contention between this idea of reliability, this idea of trust, and contention between that and what we think of as private and anonymous.
Yeah, I think part of data literacy is to have people understand the trade-offs, to not have people want things that are logically inconsistent. So if you get in a cab and the driver asks you, where are we going? And you said, oh, that's none of your business. That's my privacy. That ride won't be going very far. So people understand that. Or one of my rights in the book is the right to blur your data. So for example, geolocation data. I believe we have the right to say, what is the resolution of the data we have? Should it be 1 meter, so you know that I'm sitting next to Raven? Should it be 1 kilometer, so you know I'm in Santa Monica? Should it be 1,000 kilometers, so you know I'm in the United States? But then if I say 1,000 kilometers, then that poor Domino's pizza man who's supposed to bring the pizza to me, he would drop it anywhere in those 1,000 kilometers. So having people understand, end users, consumers, citizens, understand these necessary trade-offs is one thing I think which we all should think, how can we actually educate others?
So
by the way, as an information for you guys, this clock sort of jumped. We have 26 minutes left.
It was two
managed
parts.
I managed towards 0 here and was ready to land, and then we have to start again for the remaining 26 minutes.
So what do you think? So is there a difference? I like to ask the audience: is there a difference in what we predict the future will be in terms of privacy, internet, data, versus what we want the future to be? In other words, do we think collectively, regardless of where we're panelists or where we're in the audience, do we have a say and have a control, have a desire of what we want for the future? Or do we think the future will happen regardless of what we want?
I think we all have worked at companies that certainly have shaped the future. I mean, talking about privacy, Jeff Bezos and I always disagreed on the point, and I have to say in retrospect he was right, on whether we should have anonymous reviews, which I was pushing for, or whether he says underlying needs to be the real name that we have on people's credit cards, which I think was the right thing in retrospect. So I think we have made decisions, you at Facebook, that have influenced the world we live in. So I think the question is, what can we do to make it a world we actually want to live in? China is,
My take is that I think as citizens or anyone, whether you're an online citizen, you're a physical person, I think it's important that we think about these things and we actually ask for it. Because if you don't ask for it, then essentially you're giving the corporations and the governments the choice. So if the people don't speak up, then your decisions will be made for you. So that's the danger.
So I like to jump on the point of the idea of this, like envisioning the future, right? So I think my thoughts on this are shaped very much by my reading of *Sapiens*, and I think it has very much changed the way I thought on this topic. And what I mean by that is that I think privacy is really an intersubjective reality. It is something that we all share in our beliefs, but there is no concrete physical reality to it. In the sense that I think if we all collectively decide to believe that climate change doesn't exist, if we all collectively decide that the planet is not going to change, the planet is still going to change. It's not going to be affected by our beliefs. But I think a society in which everyone believes that privacy is not an important value is a possible society. I think that it can exist. And I think that with technology, it's conceivable that it may even be a stable and prosperous society.
Can I pick up on your future? Because I think today, where our data is being collected and pooled is known. Tomorrow, we're not going to be worrying about companies. It's every device, and we're seeing a proliferation of devices. If I turn my Nest thermometer down regularly, somebody somewhere is going to start knowing that I'm better at this ambient temperature, and they're going to derive things from it. And so every device, the Internet of Things is huge in this, and I think GDPR is upon us. And a lot of companies are considering how they're managing it. Yet, what's going to happen in the future is every device is going to be talking to every other device. The edges, actually the points and the edges in the network are just going to expand. And I think that's the future that we need to be planning for right now.
So one way to plan for it is the way the Chinese do it. So in principle, I actually agree with the approach to have an equation that captures what they think is good for society. So for example, if you are crossing the street when the light is red, your score goes down, minus a point. If you're doing fare evasion, your personal score goes down 10 points. If you are selling counterfeit goods on Taobao, your score goes up 100 points. Because clearly, you know how to do, trading. The fact that Alibaba does a score and Alibaba owns Taobao is a secondary point for right now. So the scary thing is how important those scores are. Not just for credit. And I went to the Credit Karma talk in the morning, which I thought was quite good. But way beyond that, whether your child can go to a good school in Shanghai, for instance, depends on your score. Whether you can get certain jobs depends on your score. Even whether you can take the high-speed railway between Shanghai, Hangzhou, Shanghai, Beijing, depends on the score. That is scary. But help is possible. So for example, if I posted something which was really not appropriate and my score really went down, they know that Bobby and I are WeChat friends and we chat each other quite often. So they would have a conversation with Bobby that his score also went down because we are friends. But that can be fixed if there's a conversation with me that I am changing that posting. So it is pretty amazing how on the one hand, the Chinese have that equation already, and it should be fully implemented by 2020. On the other hand, the conversation, what the terms are in the equation, what the weights are in front of these terms, that is a conversation, I think, which we can be having here, which they are not really having in public. So we talked about what weight should we have in front of the privacy coefficient.
I actually think it's a really interesting point you make about Taobao, because like what you're suggesting here is that there's some kind of value to privacy because of the asymmetry of power. Because Alibaba, if they control the credit rating, they could be using it in ways that are beneficial only to them. In which case, your loss of privacy is not fair because they are not giving up the same equal power when you lose your privacy. And I think like that's something that I think maybe suggests that is a long thesis to like why you might value privacy even in the long term.
I think the data asymmetry problem
Yes.
is a very interesting one. And if you think about, I don't know, I've catalogued in the last 15 years, there's been about 12, 15 attempts to build data marketplaces or places where individuals can effectively commercialize their own data. And I don't think that these are going to be successful because it's going to be like a distribution of, let's just say it's a class action lawsuit. Nobody's going to get out of, nobody's going to retire on the $5 they get from selling the individual's data. It's aggregate data that's the value. And so this is going to continue to keep this asymmetry in place where the aggregate data is so much more valuable than the individual's data. And so corporations are going to continue to amass data. And I think that, this is where my kind of acceptance and feeling of shorting data is happening. But I do believe that there's some advantage to going long on this, going back to that.
But for aggregate data, the question is, do individuals, as users of a service, will we ever have the right to opt out of our data being aggregated? Is that fundamentally a personal right?
So Bobby, I think actually that we are beyond that. That was the last century's discussion of whether we should be able to opt out. I think we have to accept, thus, the post-privacy title here. We have to accept that we are all creating data at the source with essentially arbitrarily high precision.
But
I mean, the audio here, you know from the quality of my voice that I had a good night's sleep before, and so on and so forth. So that, I think, there is no way to opt out.
I disagree. I think there's a way to opt out. It's just that companies are being lazy and they don't give users a choice. For companies, it's much better and easier just to not even give you the choice. And then I can aggregate data, do a lot of analysis, sell it, and market against it. But that's where I go back to privacy. If the people want it, they should go through government, and through government forces, force companies to allow for opt-out. Because otherwise, our society is going to just turn into a big system of Borgs.
But how much work, if we don't even put a price point to it, how much work are you willing to do for that process of opting out? Or in other words, who of you really fiddles with the Facebook privacy settings every single time you post something?
That's fundamentally huge systems redesign. You have to re-architect from the data model up to be able to deliver the privacy, that sort of privacy. Can I delete? Can I amend? So there's going to be rewrites of everything. It's going to be another Y2K. And I know we've discussed whether Y2K was a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting point that I think that Bobby made, which is that the idea of for companies to make the investment in providing these services. I think like theoretically that's possible. I think the question I have for that vision is, one way of achieving it is government regulation. Another way of achieving it is market demand. So like in the absence of government regulation, do you think that a company that provides these privacy services at a higher cost to their bottom line because they have to build all these extra safeties and extra logic into their application? Now, would such a company be more competitive against another company that's doing the same thing and not doing those checks?
To me, it's not a choice of the companies.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it's about the people. If the people insist on it, then companies have to do it because that's the law. Because people create the law. I fundamentally believe that government and law should be from the people, and not from a dictator and not from bureaucrats.
Interesting. Yeah.
So in that sense, I don't care about company A versus company B. You know, who's more competitive, who has faster to market, because company A is not encumbered by all these privacy features, whereas company B has to do it. You know, to me, that's not even a conversation. What I noticed is I was in Switzerland for in January. That's 2 months ago, and I hadn't been there in many years. And this trip, I really realized that the Swiss, any Swiss people here? They're really into privacy. You know, compared to other Europeans, and I was like, wow, okay, interesting. And you know, so in the end, it's about the people. If the people don't care about it, then that society, that country they'll just roll over you, the so-called the companies.
That's interesting. I wonder if you guys get the sense that the newer generation cares more or less about privacy.
I think they care less.
So if they care less, then what your argument pans out would be that in the future, the people wouldn't want privacy. Well,
that's why we're having this talk. That's why I'm trying to remind people that this is not something you should just let the companies and the governments roll over you.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, by using less and less cash, by using more and more PayPal and online payments, you are actually shifting the world into a less privacy world. And just be aware. That's why I still carry cash in my wallet. You know, it's really every small decision we make, every small action we make plays a part in how we shape the future. So don't let that go for free.
So just to observe here, one thing which is sort of implicit is privacy is not binary. So it's not, I'm, quote, giving up my data or giving up my privacy, an expression you hear again and again in the media, but it's certainly a gray, shades of gray. Second, what I hear is actually a multidimensional construct. It is not only more or less, but there are different dimensions to privacy. Now, let me ask you, do you think I capture enough of it if I say it is a, if you will, 2x2 matrix? There are expected things and there are unexpected things. There are good things and there are bad things. And so the bad, unexpected, for instance, would be government putting you in prison. The expected bad is the slow erosion of privacy and you getting more and more bothered by certain ads, for instance. Is that all we need in terms of dimensions, or are there other dimensions to privacy that are heard sort of the two of you here warming up to?
I think that's when you say just now that privacy is a romantic notion. I think that's definitely kind of like how I see it. Like in my personal life, I think I value privacy. But I cannot get over the feeling that this is just my personal subjectivity. Like this is my personal subjective preference. My question is 20, 30 years from now, the world has no privacy. People live in a post-privacy world. Are those people going to look back at us and be like, why didn't you guys do something about it? Or will they be like, those guys were stuck in the past and we have a much better present?
Good question. So do they think those guys fucked up, or do you think those guys were stupid?
Because
what was their problem?
Because I think the answer for climate change for me is very obvious. The answer for privacy to me is less obvious.
Good.
What's obvious answer for
climate change?
Climate change.
Yeah.
Because the answer for climate change will be that yes, we fucked up. But the answer for privacy may very well be that I'm glad that we are in a more progressed society and we got over that notion, the romantic notion that we were so enamored with.
I think that's a wonderful way to open up, include the conversation with the audience, and see who of you has something to add, questions maybe, or just wants to comment on Raven's beautiful point, whether in 20 years from now, people will look back and say, I can't believe that those guys worried about that stuff, or I can't believe what decisions these people made that we all need to suffer on right now. Thank you for making that very clear. All right, so what I think I as moderator do, I just take your questions and repeat them back to the audience. I think he was first in the back.
I just think the privacy thing online scares people because it's new. I've used credit cards for 20, 30 years. I never really thought about the fact that the credit card companies know where I am, what I'm buying, how much I'm spending. They have an enormous amount of data about me. It never bothered me because it was something I grew up with and used from the time I was a teenager, right? So I think it's a generational thing that's part of our mind, that people get comfortable with it. But my wife is all freaked out about the fact we have a private telephone number for our old landline phone. And yes, we do still have a landline phone. And she got a private telephone number. I said, well, why do you have a private telephone number? So people would know our address from the listing in the phone directory. And I'm saying, you tell people your address every time you write a check. It's on our checks, right? So the world knows our address. You can look online on Google and come up with it in 2 seconds. And yet, in her mind, there was some privacy element that needed to be protected there, just because historically people wanted private telephone numbers, and she hadn't, progressed the 20 years later, right?
So Gam and I always love to think about sign flips and talking about phone numbers. It's amazing. I remember when caller ID came out, and I said, no way. I want that company to know that I'm calling them. So I dialed star something something, and I didn't transmit my caller ID. Now, I mean, most of us don't answer calls that come in without caller ID. So that's one of these beautiful examples where we see that a whole society flipped from one default to another default. Does anybody have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So I envisage a future where we're all wearing something with a head-up display. And as I look across the room, I'm going to see facts about you all, except perhaps you, at which point you become very suspicious to me, because you haven't shared your information. And I think that's going to be one of the new paradigms.
Yeah, it's interesting because we can easily look back at that previous generation and be like, why did we give up their privacy? But instead we look back and be like, oh, we live in a better world now. It's more convenient. We have all these better services. So I think expectations change, and I don't know at the core of it what is the essential element that we want to preserve.
So here's a question, back a little bit what you said. I assume many of you or all of you are on Facebook. Anyone not on Facebook? Like, oh, a few. Okay. So I'm not on Facebook. So the question is, does it mean that in the US I should have a lower credit rating and have a lower trustworthiness because you cannot find me on Facebook?
It sounds bad, but probably it does.
But here what it means is that Gam, or more specifically, a lady called Rebecca, is actually making up for you.
Yeah, I ran an experiment a few years ago, and I was trying to create a completely digital person, and I created a Facebook identity, and I gave her a full history, and then I matched it with a LinkedIn and a Twitter.
It's a fake person.
Yeah, it's a fake person,
Yeah.
and she managed to make about 800 friends whom she conversed with generally, and there was no way of digitally telling that she was fake because she's being operated by me yet. And today, even to this day, she's still up on LinkedIn. She gets more job offers than I do. Because, but it's possible, and so this authentication of real person is also part of this debate.
Next question.
Andreas, you brought up a very interesting statistic about millennials decreasing television usage by 40% of that time. I have a question for you now. What would have to happen for the ascension of the use of the smartphone to level off or possibly go down? because I think since 1984 we've seen people use their mobile phones more. So what would have to happen? What would be an incident?
I think it's VR. I think people are going to start plugging into VR, and they're just going to be plugged in for 3 hours, 6 hours a day, and then they're going to stop using phones for those 6 hours.
I think
So we're not there yet, but give us 5 years. I think we're going to see society move in that. It's
Or I
already
could
happening.
argue that the distinction between a phone and a PC, which has already disappeared, a phone and VR will be disappearing.
It's already happening with kids who play Minecraft. Do any of your kids play Minecraft? Some of them are playing it for 3-6 hours a day, and they're just so plugged in, right? So it ties into privacy in the sense that with these VR experiences and these games, people go in and become a new person. It's a new identity. So in this case, you're talking about creating a new digital identity of someone on Facebook, LinkedIn. But when you go into these virtual reality systems, a man could be a woman, you could be an animal, you could be a beast, you could be a robot. So that's I think that's what's going to happen to life.
Yeah, I think that's like basically saying that the technology change and improving the way of consumption basically obsoletes the previous form of consumption. I think like mobile devices probably will suffer a similar fate. I don't really know if it's going to be VR or if it's going to be some sort of like wearable devices or if some sort of like embedded devices, implants, I don't know. But like it feels like that's the direction. But to the point of television, I think like it feels to me that there could conceivably be technology that are more timeless. I think like even with smartphones today, we still use pen and paper. And I think there are use cases for that. I don't see that for television, which is why it's going away. And I think I could potentially see that for smartphones. So maybe there's a longer lasting effect.
I think there's going to be convergence. If you think about the new generation of hearing aids, they're Bluetooth enabled. So if I think that I'm listening to the conversation in this room, then if I was wearing a hearing aid, and I could retune it into the conversation in the next room, and I could be part of that conversation. And I think the same is going to be true with screens, and we're going to be able to just blend the experience of real life and digital life, and it's going to fuse, and I think I'm seeing that fusion already.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. What I propose is, if people in the audience still have questions, we just listen to the questions, and then if there's something we want to answer, we answer it, and then we wrap up. So rather than picking individual people and answering them, let's just listen to what people have.
More than a question, it would be a comment.
Santiago.
Today, the reality is we have a lack of privacy. So we have cameras everywhere. I assume that every time that I talk on the phone, someone is listening or taking it, and it is sent when I write an email. So we have a total lack of privacy today.
Yeah. As we said,
is there a way to recover part of that or not? Because with the cameras,
get over it, yeah.
there's no way.
Okay.
Well, there is.
Let's actually just
Okay.
go runs. And also, there's the first lady. Let's have the first lady question. So far, it's a male-only conversation here. Please.
So I guess it is a generational thing, but I'm actually of the mind that learn everything you can about me. I actually get disappointed when Facebook gives me a wrong ad. And I hear that a lot from the women and other members that I work with because I run the Double Ones Entrepreneur Network. And again, if I send something to them after they've already given me their data, they say like, why did you give this to me? You should have known this about me anyway. I'm just curious about that direction, that when you're not strategic with the information that I've given you, have you failed me? So I'm just curious.
Yeah. Got it.
I don't know if you covered this in the first 10 minutes because I walked in late, but I don't even understand. Humanity never had privacy. People never had privacy. And it's kind of a last 10, 20 years kind of thing because of the scale of it. When you live in a village 100 years ago, you walk in a store, the person recognizes you, knows what you like to buy because they can observe you, right? I sit here, I know each of you, what you wear, how you move your neck, what's your body language and so on. The problem is that digitally you have it at scale everywhere when you want to expect it.
Anybody on the right-hand side, which I tend to ignore because I'm facing that way? Any of the people sitting on the
There's
floor?
one.
I think you should summarize.
Any comments?
Talk about the last thing.
Make a general comment. We listened to this, and yet everybody was long on privacy, basically, in the audience.
Not really.
20% was short, and 80% were long. And yet, everything we've talked about argues that the value of privacy is going to go down. So, my question would be, have you convinced people through this panel in your own conversation that you should be short on privacy?
So let's reflect that question back to the audience and ask, did anybody change their opinion, whether they would be long on privacy or whether they would want to be short on privacy? It is an audience that believes in being consistent in their investment hypotheses. 1 minute for each of you on closing remarks on something which you wanted to say and I didn't let you to.
Yeah, so I actually think that the question of whether we ever had privacy is interesting because I do think that there is a change in the quality of privacy that we can expect. I think that it is different to be in a village and be recognized by anyone than to be recognized by random parts of the internet, be recognized by random companies that you have no contact with before. I think that is a pretty substantive change. And I don't argue that I think that privacy is decreasing. And I think that I can imagine a world where that is a good thing. And maybe that's what I mean by shorting of privacy. Maybe there is opportunity there. Maybe it is a risky investment to over-index on privacy when the rest of society is going to change around you.
So I'm going to take a different tack on this. It's just what is happening with data. We're seeing a proliferation of data. It's huge. Back, I don't know when Neil Gershenfeld wrote his book, When Things Begin to Think, he had this concept, one chapter of it was when currency has behavior in addition to value. I believe that data is also going to get its own behavior. So when you send out a packet of data, it will come with instructions as to how it should be processed and handled. And I believe that permissions is part of that.
Okay. So the angle I want to remind the audience is about privacy in relation not to data and behavior online, but rather privacy in relation to money and how money is spent. Okay. So obviously, you know, if you're staying at this hotel, you're checking in, you have to do a form of payment, a sort of a credit card authorization hold. So the hotel will know who you are, so that's fine. But the question is, do you really want that knowledge to be publicly available, or do you want to have privacy of purchases and privacy of spending? I don't care if it's a hotel, if it's buying a cup of coffee, or buying a new Tesla car, or even making a payment for tuition for your children. So I think that's something that's worth thinking about, because if we don't think about it as citizens, as netizens, then it's very likely that the companies and the banks and the financial systems and the government, you know, will just take it away from you. So that's my sort of take on this.
So, ladies and gentlemen, all that's left for me is to thank Raven, Jiang, and Bobby of blindly trusting me without much data on coming down here to Santa Monica and doing an hour of a great conversation.
And losing all privacy in the meantime.
I'll be here until Friday when I leave, as you can see on Weigend.com/where for Australia. So if anyone wants to talk more, I would love to talk more with you. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists.